I am Joseph Beaver of the Black Historical and Cultural Society of the Coachella Valley, based in Palm Springs. I am doing this interview this January 16, 1987, for the Palm Springs Public Library Center's Local History Project. I might mention that the temperatures here are very uncharacteristic of Palm Springs, going down into the low 20s at night and going no higher than in the 40s during the day. I'm very pleased to be talking with Mrs. Benny Mae Crawford at her Palm Springs residence. And Mrs. Crawford is one of the pioneer residents of this community and has wielded considerable influence in the history and culture of the black community. Mrs. Crawford, greetings this afternoon. When did you arrive in Palm Springs? More or less.
I arrived in Palm Springs in the year of 1942, November the 15th.
It's excellent memory, the exact day. And where did you come from originally?
Originally I came from Texas, the east part of Texas, which the town was named Carthage, Texas, which is the county seat of Panola County. And so when I left coming here, I followed my husband out here. He had been here for about a couple of months, and then he sent for me to come, and my parents didn't want me to come because they thought that was going out of the world. But I was, as saying say, I was bent and bound, and nothing to keep me from coming. So when we arrived here, well, my husband was at work. He'd done the wall, which was done construction work at the El Mirador Hotel. They was building barracks there. And then it was a big hospital, which was known as the Tony General Hospital. And there was plenty of work then, and all he was doing, looking forward to trying to make some money. Because when he left Texas and come to California, he was only making 65 cents an hour. So he couldn't go very far on that.
And your husband, what was his name?
My husband's named Coyle Crawford.
Mr. Crawford, I understand, was a carpenter by trade and vocation.
Later years. Then he took up carpentering, and he did the carpenter the rest of his life.
I see. More or less, what was your mode of travel? How did you come out by car or train, or just how did you travel from Texas to Palm Springs back in the early 40s?
We traveled from Texas in a car, which was 6 of us, and that's a long ride for 6 people in a car.
That is.
And it took us 2 days and nights to get here. So anyway, the one that couldn't drive was always set up with the front with the one that was driving, and let the one that could drive sit in the back where he could sleep. So that seemed like it was going out of the world, and we was coming, but it took a long time.
And you brought your furniture with you, or you traveled light, or just what?
We had traveled light because we had shipped our
your belongings ahead. I see. What did you do when you first arrived here?
Well, first arrived, all I could do was look at the mountains and look at the desert and look at everything, and I just couldn't figure out that this was another world. So when we then it was the mountains, a lot of in the road. They was crooked then. They've straightened them out now. But anyway, and they called them dips. And all we did was up and down in dips. But anyway, when we got here, we stopped over in Indio, and then we came on to Palm Springs. The lady that brought us was named, forgot her name.
The name escapes you right now. Were the roads paved? Or
yeah, they was paved, but they very narrow.
Yes, I see. Now, your husband was working in construction. Were you also employed? Did you get a job, or did you just remain a housewife?
No, I maintained a job on November the 27th at the Tony General Hospital in the kitchen. I was a kitchen helper. You know,
And so that was really your first job here.
that was my first job.
What was that like? What were the circumstances? Were there relatively good working conditions?
It was good working conditions because it was a army hospital,
Oh yes.
and it was good working conditions.
And when you were not working, more or less, how did you spend your time?
Well, at that particular time, it wasn't nothing that I wasn't working. I was working all the time.
I see. And you and Mr. Crawford, where did you live when you first came to Palm Springs?
When we first came to Palm Springs, he had found a place to live, which was, the lady was named Ola McDowell. And she had a bunch of children, and she had a big house, and she rented him a room, he and his brother. And then we got here, his brother's wife and myself, well, we all had a room about a 12 by 12, and we slept in the room together. His brother worked at nighttime, and he worked in the daytime, and I worked in the daytime. So, but anyway, this lady, she took her children and put them all bunched up together, and she made a way for us a place to stay. So we stayed there for 2 months, and then we found a little house which belonged to lady was named Van Williams, and she rented us a room, and the room was very small with a twin bed, and that's what we had to sleep in, 2 adult people sleeping in a twin bed. We couldn't even turn over in one ton, and the other had to turn. So it was fun. We didn't pay that no attention. So finally, I asked the lady if I'd buy a mattress. Would she care? She says no. So we went out and bought us a bed then. So it was very nice, because all we did was work.
Now, Mrs. McDowell, that was Ola McDowell,
Ola
is that correct?
McDowell.
And she was quite outgoing in helping blacks who were newcomers in the community.
That's right.
And she had this big house and
Yes.
accommodated and just reached out and helped people.
She did. She'd accommodate anybody come. She'd just move over and make room. And
When she left, is she still in Palm Springs, or did she leave, or?
no, they moved to San Bernardino
I see.
after about a couple of years.
So she provided a great family atmosphere.
Yes.
In that. Is she still living? And
Yes, she's still living.
She must be along in years.
Oh,
now.
she is. She's up in her 80s.
I see.
But she was very accommodating, helping people coming, because at that particular time, black didn't have anywhere to stay. It wasn't but 3 or 4 houses here belonged to the black, and they was small places. But she had, by her having a big family, she had a big house, and she would help anybody that come. She'd give them a place to stay overnight.
Now, you lived in Section 14 on the Indian Reservation.
Yes.
The residence that you're referring to now, was that actually on the Indian Reservation?
Yes.
I see.
It was on El Segundo and Arenas Road.
And that reservation, known as Section 14, that extended along what? Indian Avenue and Celia and El Segundo?
Yes.
It was about, what, a square mile, something like that?
Something like that.
I see. It's a good location. And you came there in 42. And
42.
and that was your first residence on the reservation.
Yes.
Were there many blacks in the population at that time? Were there many black people there?
No, it wasn't. It wasn't many, because when you'd see a black person at that particular time, you were glad to see one. Very few.
There was a time in history when black people saw one another, they bowed, more or less, didn't they? Do you recall those days? So you lived right where the spa, or in that, right around the spa, where the spa is, and at that time it was strictly Indian. It was a hot spring.
That's
and what
right.
did they call it?
The Indian bathhouse.
I see. And that was still controlled by
the
Indians.
Uh-huh.
And the Indians were very liberal in allowing people to live on the reservations, right?
They were
Mhm.
very liberal,
Mm-hmm.
and they let you build a house or build whatever you could on their land,
Mm-hmm.
and they would charge you very little rent.
Mm-hmm. I see. And did your husband construct your house, the house you lived in?
No, he didn't construct it, but he did add on a room.
I
We
see.
bought that house, and we only paid $600
Mm-hmm.
for the house at that time,
Mm-hmm.
and it was
Mm-hmm. Oh, that sounds reasonable.
it was livable.
Yes. And what kind of conditions were there? Did you have a modern bath? And what kind of stove, what kind of cooking utensils and so forth did you have?
Well, we didn't have modern bath because we had to go outside to a toilet.
The old outhouses?
Yes, the outhouse.
Mm-hmm.
And had a shower built out there too, so we took the shower out there. But in later years, my husband built a modern bath,
Mm-hmm.
and then and the cooking, we had butane gas,
Mm-hmm.
gas stove.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes you'd be in the middle of cooking a meal and your gas would run out.
Mm-hmm.
And then we had to order some gas, which the man that had the charge of the gas was Pavany.
Mm-hmm.
He served the Section 14 all around with butane gas.
Mm-hmm.
And but as I said, in the middle of a meal cooking and you run out of gas, and you just had to wait until you could get Pavany to bring you some gas. If it's
Mhm.
nighttime, you just had to do without.
Mm-hmm.
So it was very inconvenient in a lot of ways.
Mm-hmm. Well, those days are gone, huh?
Yes,
at
they
least,
are.
At least some aspects.
Yeah, I appreciate pushing buttons.
Yes. With whom were you first associated with when you first moved here? Your family. You mentioned a brother,
Yeah.
or a brother and a brother-in-law.
Yes, my husband's brother.
I see. And what was his name?
His name was Lloyd.
I see. Lloyd Crawford.
Yes.
Uh-huh. And any other relatives? Did you have children?
No, I didn't have any children.
I see. Uh-huh.
And didn't have myself. I didn't have any relatives here. I just come
Mhm.
by myself to my
Mhm.
husband.
Mhm. Who were some of your friends or other people whose names you can recall, and maybe tell us a little something about them back in those days? Others who lived in the same section on the Indian reservation, or who were your working companions, persons you worked with or for?
Oh, I worked with Fanny Crossley,
Mm-hmm.
and I worked with Ada Knox, and Lucy Johnson, and well, I can't remember all of them's name now.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, it wasn't too many because it was mostly on Section 14, as I say, was mostly just for the Negroes and the Indians. And it wasn't too many peoples there then.
Mm-hmm.
But as they migrated in, it was a few more. But everybody was interested in working, and so we didn't commute too much together because everybody was going to and fro to work.
Mm-hmm. 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 Now, in the what did you do for shopping, and what kind of recreation was available? Or did you just make recreation for yourself, or, when you had your weekends off or your time? Because I understand there was hardly a church back in those days,
No.
at least conveniently.
No, at that particular time wasn't any church. And the church that Elder W.R. Wise, he founded a church. And at the start with, where we started in a Mexican hall, which they call, where the Mexicans had their meeting,
Mm-hmm.
and where if they wanted to have something that Friday, Saturday, Sunday night, whatever it is, well, we had to move out.
Mm-hmm.
And so then after we kept doing that for a while, then finally Elder Wise decided he would build a church. So he built a church, a very small church, but it was enough to accommodate the people that was there. We didn't have any outlook that the community was going to grow.
Mm-hmm.
So he built a church, and then later years, Baptist church began, which the pastor there was Reverend White.
I see.
He established a Baptist church. But they used to have church in the Aloysius church. We got together that way.
Mhm.
One had one Sunday, the other had the other Sunday.
Mhm.
So that's where the churches began.
Mhm. What was the name of Elder Wise's church? Can you recall?
New Bethel Church of God in Christ.
I see. New Bethel Church of God in Christ. And that
Yes.
was the first black.
That was the
black
first black
church.
church.
We're speaking about black churches and Mexican churches and white churches. You know, when we're all human, really, we
Yeah,
should be able to say
right.
church. Period.
Right.
You're now when you shopped, was there any place to shop for clothes and just the ordinary things of life in Palm Springs, or did you have to more or less leave the city and go elsewhere just to shop, you know, at reasonable prices and so forth?
Once in a while, sometime we shop here, but not very much. We mostly went to San Bernardino, to Banning, to Riverside, because things was much cheaper.
Mm-hmm.
And so we'd always go out there. Of course, wasn't any place here to go, and so weekends we would love to, go, and then we'd do our shopping too.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What about doctors? There was a hospital at that time.
Well, it's El Merito Hospital,
Yes, I see.
as far as I know.
Yeah. So you had access to a doctor here. We're talking about the early 40s and so
Yes.
forth, aren't we?
Yes, it is.
So there were doctors. There was a drugstore, pharmacy,
Yes,
and there was a hospital.
yes.
At least some, yes. All right. Pardon me. Can you recall who were some of the important people, influential people in that period?
Well, in that period of time, you mean among the blacks, among people?
Either way, or
Well,
both, or we can distinguish which,
Mhm.
if you
Well,
like.
among peoples, well, you just didn't know the peoples. You didn't know them. You was
Mhm.
just a stranger.
Mm-hmm.
And finally, we got, met Mr. Crossley, Mr. Carr, and a few more around.
Mm-hmm.
But Mr. Crossley was one of the main one. Anybody would come here, they would recommend you to cross this track.
Mm-hmm.
He was out there on Ramon Road. And
That was Ramon and Sunrise,
Ramon
right in
and
that
Sunrise
section.
in that section.
Did he have a trailer camp or what?
Well, he had them both.
I see. This is Lawrence Crossley.
Lawrence Crossley.
Yes.
And so he would have little houses and trailers and whatever he had. He would rent it
Mm-hmm.
to the people.
I see. For a reasonable rates.
Reasonable, very reasonable rate.
Mm-hmm. We've learned from Mr. Culver Nichols, one of the, I guess, founding fathers here, that Lawrence Crossley built the very first golf course in the city,
Yes.
and then went on to maintain it after that. And then, well, he worked for Mr. Culver Nichols, as a matter of fact, and he was the distributor of water at the plant, at the water works.
Yes. Mhm.
And that then he went on to become a prospector for gold, as he'd made many contacts amongst the Indians and throughout Southern California and on over into Arizona. I understand he was quite a figure in himself, his
Yes.
contributions.
Yes,
in
he
the
would say,
community.
if you wanted to know anything, ask Lawrence Crossley.
Mm-hmm.
And he was over the water rights of the irrigation from Whitewater.
Mm-hmm. I understand that Mr. Lawrence Crossley, he came here from Louisiana.
In Louisiana.
Mm-hmm. And he was quite a pioneer and exerted a lot of initiative and leadership in this community. He had a cousin, Willie Crossley, who
Yeah.
sort of followed in his footsteps so far as distributing the water
That's right.
and at the plant. And he just died, when did he die? He just passed away recently, didn't he? Last May, I believe.
Willie Crossley?
Yes,
He passed away
Willie.
last May.
Yes.
He had moved to Riverside.
Mm-hmm. And Mrs. Fanny Crossley, the widow of Lawrence, or the widow of Willie.
Willie.
Yes, she resides in Sunnymead, but I understand she's bedridden and
Yes.
not doing too well
No, she isn't
health-wise.
done too well at all. She has a son and a daughter.
I see.
The daughter is Wilhelmina, and the son is Frank Devers.
I see. And Lawrence has 2 surviving daughters.
Yes.
I understand. One is Margaret Tabor,
Yes.
and the other one is
Yvonne.
Yvonne. And where do they reside now? Where are they still around in this area, or where?
No, they're not in this area. They're in the Los Angeles area somewhere.
I see. And Mr. Lloyd Goff, he was rather prominent also, I understand,
Yeah.
back in those days. And he was Lawrence Crosley's nephew.
Yes, he was his nephew.
Yes, I see.
Lawrence Crosley, I think he was the first black that settled here in Palm Springs.
Oh, really?
And see, the others, when the people used to bring their chauffeurs and their maids down here, but they just stayed where they were working. They didn't obtain any property or anything.
But he was the first black settler in
Yes.
a way, for real, in that
Yes.
sense. I see here you're quite a collector of some old newspapers and memorabilia here of your own. And I
Yes.
see here, as a matter of fact, this is the first time I've seen a picture of Mr. Lawrence Crosley. This is back in the Daily Enterprise of September 15, 1967. And this is my first occasion to even seeing a photo of him. And this was in, I guess, the settlement estate regarding that. And here's they're referring to the widow. This is a picture of Mrs. Martha Crosley, who was the wife of Mr. Lawrence Crosley. It's very interesting. I notice you have a number of other most interesting newspapers.
Yes, I used to read a lot.
Indeed. This one, I think, is very relevant also. I see the Press Enterprise they put out an issue on Negro pioneers fight hostility of man and desert. And a lot of some blacks we observed came out here, and they were very disillusioned because of racism and restrictive land covenants and a number of problems of this sort here.
They couldn't buy no land any place, and they come down and it's going to shove us off of Section 14. That's the word we use. But we didn't have anywhere to go, and they wouldn't sell us any land. So then we started hunting. They says Garnett, and then they say the North End, which this was called the North End where I am right now, and then out across the track, which is about 6 or 7 miles east of here. And so then they wouldn't sell no land, and folks then they migrated from Bannon and to San Bernardino, to Garnett, to Riverside, wherever they could buy something. Because when we was living on Section 14, we just paid rent, paid taxes. They say if anything come up by the taxes, that we would get our money back. But when it come down to shoving us off the reservation, they didn't know nothing about it. So all that went down the drain. So we didn't have anything. Then everybody started hunting somewhere to go. So then someone said out here on the North End that was a good place, and then some man by the name, I forget his name, he started selling to black out here, and then got a little hostile about that because they didn't want the blacks this close into town. So, but anyway, that they continues to buy out here. And I think I was near the last one to move from the reservation because I thought I could stick it out. But I didn't. And when I moved the next day, I didn't tear my house down. I gave it to somebody, and then they moved it to Garnett. So it's out there now. But anyway, when they started buying out here and it was so windy, you almost had to tie yourself down to go from out here. So I says, I don't want no part of that North End. That's what they called it then, the North End. So, but come down finally, I love the North End. I love the section. Because they put a wall up between us out here like we're behind the walls, but we still here.
And that wall was where? That wall was off of Indian Avenue? You might comment a bit about that.
Yes, it was, well, they had a wall up here by the gate, by the church. And you could come in from 111 there and turn around and go back and come in here and turn around and go back. You wasn't allowed over in the gateway section.
Mm-hmm.
So, but then eventually later on they finally opened up after they started selling to blacks in the gateway estate. Then they opened that wall up down there, made it a through street.
That's interesting that you had a wall here. You know, we're so busy denouncing the Berlin Wall and
Yes.
some other walls.
Yes, that's what
And curtains and things around the world. So they put up a wall right down here in Palm Springs.
yes, they did.
Interesting. You were active with the church, I presume,
Yes,
from the
from section 14.
yes. And how many pastors can you remember from starting with Elder
Wise.
Wise?
Elder Wise was he was here for a long time. He moved out here with on Tramview. Then he died. Then another man came by the name of and then we have a pastor, Alan Black. That's who we have now. So just only on a 3 pastorship.
You said before there were very few black people at the time in Palm Springs.
Yes.
There were very few people, relatively speaking, period, weren't there?
Yes, very few.
The population was very sparse
Very small.
at that period. Now, on the reservation, you had blacks living there in the particular section that you more or less
Mostly
occupied.
that's where the black living on across the track.
Yes.
That's what they call it.
And
Out on the land. They call it the land too. Had 2 names.
I see.
Across the
They
track
called that
and
the land.
Yes.
How interesting.
Yeah.
You had Indians living there. There were blacks,
Yes.
and there were Mexicans.
Indians, Mexican, and black, and they was so nice to get along together.
It was like a big family
Yes.
atmosphere.
hmm
And can you remember some of the Mexican people who lived there at the time that you did? You can think back.
I'll think back at yes. They was Hernandez and Prietas. The Prietas was one of the main source among the Mexicans. The Prietas and Johnny Herrera, which was there. He was an Indian. And
What did he do? What was his occupation?
his occupation was a policeman.
Oh, I see. He was an Indian policeman,
Yes.
more or less. Uh-huh.
And then Mr. Spalletti, but he was an Indian, and he provided places for blacks to live. Anybody, he would provide.
Did you have much association with the white population in those days, or
No.
relatively none?
No, there wasn't any.
Where did the support for the black community mainly come from? Help like Mrs. McDowell, Mr. Crosley, and your churches? And if there were problems or hardships or someone were in desperate need of help or something, who would you turn to? Would you turn to relatives or the church or the government or just who?
No, we turned to the church and to the relatives, to not relatives, but to the relatives, to the people, like Mrs. McDowell, Mr. Crosley, and Mr. Spalletti. You could turn to get help from them, and some of the Mexican friends.
Now, did you later on? Then as you just you indicated, people were more or less forced to relocate and leave the Indian reservation.
Yes.
What was that about? And I mean, what kind of pressure was exerted on you to force you to leave your residences in section 14? Or
Well, they just come in one day and said you had to move out, and then if you didn't move, then they'd come in, and force you out. And then as soon as you get out, then they would burn the house, tear it down, demolish it.
Did they give people any
No,
compensation?
Didn't give them
Nothing?
anything. They just, all that was lost. Didn't give them anything to survive on.
And so at that time, it was like you were just dispersed, huh? And
Yes.
So some came out here to the north, and some went to the Crosley track,
yes.
and then some others went as far away as San Bernardino,
Yes,
Banning, and
and they
Riverside,
did.
and so forth. And so you relocated at that time. You came out here.
Came here.
Yes, I see. And you've been here how long now? And
Since 65.
I see. Uh-huh. Can you recall any of the, say, the pioneers out in West Garnett? That's sort of an interesting and little known about community, isn't it?
Yes. Well, out there was Jesse Haraway, and they went out there and they dug a well. The water was very poor. Sometimes they wouldn't even have water. And he still maintained it and kept on, kept. So now I think they have a different well now. They have no trouble with their water. Minus Walton and Seals Hill, U.L. Powell, they all was done very well out there. I don't know some of the rest of them. I can't think of all of them names. It's quite a community out there now.
That's what I understand.
Yes. They have a church out there, 2 churches.
I see. Back to this subject of prejudice, just once again, as we have lived in a historically prejudiced society. What things couldn't you do as a black person in this community, and was there any place you couldn't go or things you couldn't do? And you've already briefly mentioned there was restrictive land covenants where you couldn't buy property. What about the movie house? Were the movies integrated, or were there separate places for black people? When celebrities came here, and I understand some celebrities did visit this area, where did they stay? Were they allowed to stay at the big hotels, or how many hotels did you have back in those days?
Well, I don't remember how many, but I do know it was the Del Tacos Hotel, the Desert Inn Hotel, and the Plaza Hotel. Now, I remember those. But only, they did have a place set up, I guess, when they bring their help in. I guess they had a place for them to stay. But they didn't have any place to stay because they said they didn't even know there was any black people that was in Palm Springs. So but at the Desert Inn, they'd have rooms up there for them.
So by special arrangement.
Special arrangement is right.
What about the movie house? Did you have a movie house here?
There was 2 theaters, the Plaza Theater and the Palm Springs Theater at that time. And at the theater at Palm Springs, you had to sit up in the balcony.
All black people had to sit up in the balcony.
Yes. And I don't know about the Plaza, because that's the Palm Springs was the only one that we would go to. So I think the Plaza was mostly for the other folks that had more money.
I see. You mentioned at one time, was it Mrs. Fanny Thomas?
Yes.
And what did she had arranged a concert for the great Mahalia Jackson?
Yes, she did.
Isn't that
That
beautiful?
was very good. And she brought her down, and she had at the Plaza Theater. She rented the Plaza Theater, however you would say it, and she had her there, and she had a crowd.
I imagine so.
It was very good. And then
no, Mahalia was a national treasure, wasn't
yes,
she?
and everybody wanted to see Mahalia Jackson.
Fantastic voice and religious. Now, when you worked at the hospital,
Yes. Not the hospital, the Tony General Hospital. Yes, it was.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And after that employment, where did you work after that?
I started doing domestic work, day work, from house to house.
I see.
And, so that's what I've been doing from then on till now.
I see. And your husband, did he stay in construction work? Did he remain in building houses and that sort of thing? Did that opportunity continue? Was there still
Yes,
a building boom of sorts?
Oh yes.
Yes. When did Mr. Crosley pass away?
Mr. Crawford?
Mr. Crawford, I'm
He
sorry.
passed away this year.
Oh, I see. Very recent. As the town changed, and as the The population increased, activity, there were more cars, there were more buildings and so forth. How did this growth affect your life, actually? Or did it? Or by this time were you sort of away from it all and sort of living quietly, or just what? Or did this growth affect you at all?
Well, I think it did, in a way.
Mhm.
It improved me some, and I told him I thought I knew what progress was when I was young and going to school. But after I saw Palm Springs grow like it have, I said, now I know what progress is.
Yes.
'Cause
Mhm.
I see the progress. See, this is over 100% progress
Mhm.
where this have grown.
Mhm. These three hotels that you mentioned, is any one of those still in existence, or did they tear them down? Where were they located, and what did they build in those areas? I mean, where are the sites that we would recognize if
Well,
we went to that site now?
You wouldn't recognize it, 'cause down where the liquor barn is, that's where
Mhm.
Del Tacos was.
That's where Safeway was
Yes.
in the interim.
Yes,
That was a
And-
Del Taco.
that was a Del
I
Tacos
see.
hotel. And
Mhm.
the the Desert Inn Hotel was behind the Palm Springs Theater. I can't say high, but it was round and among there about Maxine and back up in there somewhere or another.
Mhm.
See, that was back off the street. You couldn't see it.
Mhm.
But
Mhm.
anyway, and the Plaza Hotel is still there.
Mhm.
That's down where Desmond is.
I see. Oh yes. So that's still there.
Yes, that's still there.
Mhm. Now we know that back in those days, the same as now, you didn't have. I mean, the climate was still.
Oh, climate
You had
was
some pretty
wonderful.
hot days, 120, 130 degrees.
Yes.
Of course, you had no smog,
No smog,
and you didn't
No
have
air
this
condition.
humidity, and no air conditioning.
no air condition.
Was it tolerable? I
Oh
mean,
yes.
it didn't
It-
bother you.
Well, we were here. We had to stay here.
Yeah.
It-
During summers, did you stay here during those
Yes.
torrid summers?
Yes.
You didn't go away during
No.
summers like a lot of people did.
Well, we couldn't afford it.
I see.
So that was the main working time, like in the summertime.
Mm-hmm.
Then.
Mm-hmm. I've recently learned that you crochet beautiful garments, shawls and so forth, and that you enter some of these items in the Indio Date Festival
Yes.
every year. How long have you been entering your
I've been
works?
in about 10 years, and
Is
I
that right?
would win a prize every year.
Mm-hmm.
First sometime and second sometime. And I used to cook cakes and take down there, and I won first prizes on the cakes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You want to demonstrate? We have one is right here, isn't it, behind you?
Yes.
Yeah, this is beautiful work, handcraft. Am I holding it correctly? Yeah. See, that is attractive, isn't it? And here's another one over here. Yeah, pardon
And
me.
the cat.
One here and one up here. These are most attractive, aren't they? Beautiful work. So you're going to enter these in the Indio Date
And
Festival
then,
this
I've
year.
already sent my interest in. I was supposed to take them in February.
I see.
My
how
entry blank
wonderful.
is already in. I'm in 3.
How wonderful.
This is something I would want over there. Thank you very much for that. I just sit and that's a lot of my recreation. I sit here and crochet, and I read a little bit. My eyes are bad. I don't read as much, but I usually crochet a lot. I keep something going.
Well, I think that happens with all of us with advancing years. What are the impressions between, let's say, then and now of this community and your experience here in Palm Springs?
Well, I think this community is a very nice community. It's a lot of progress have been made since we've been in this, which they call it now the Highland Estate. There's been a lot of improvement done. You know,
So this is a Highland Park Estates now, or Highland Estates?
Highland Estate.
I see. So What was the distinction between the Gateway and the North End, or the Gateway and the Highland Estates?
I don't know what's the difference was with the gate. Well, one thing about the Gateway, it used to be all was white that lived in the Gateway.
I see.
And after, well, it's still the Gateway, but most of the whites have moved. There's a few up there now, but most of them have moved out.
Mm-hmm. Now, was there also a Tockwitz Hotel here?
That's Del Tockwitz.
What's that?
That was Del Tockwitz.
Oh, I see. All right. I'm just, my pronunciation
Yes,
is poor.
Del Tockwitz Hotel.
And I understand that Cullen, was it Cullen Wilson?
Cullen
was
Wilson.
a chef there?
Yes.
I see. Cullen and Viola was his wife?
Yes.
They were old timers of Palm Springs.
Yes, they
and they
were.
lived on the reservation
Yes,
at the time
they
you
lived
did?
on the reservation
I
too.
see. And where are they now?
They lives in Banning now.
I see.
They moved. That's why they in Banning, because at the time the Section 14 dispersed. Well, then they moved to Banning.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. There have been some problems here for young people, right, for their future. The young black people who are otherwise promising, they find that the doors of opportunity sort of close on them. There's a lack of upward mobility opportunity.
Yes, for the blacks,
Mm-hmm.
the youngers.
Why is this? What seems to be? What
Well-
is your observation?
Well, I don't know. I've been working on it, trying to find out why. I don't know whether it's with the city or with the peoples.
Mm-hmm.
Whether it's because you gotta give them an opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
So, but the doors are closed, and they have such a time of trying to land jobs. As the saying say, we'll call you. Don't you
Mhm.
call us? See, they never call, and
And they never call.
never call.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So it's just, it's been kind of rough with the younger bunch.
Mm-hmm.
What is?
Mrs. Crawford, a little more about some of these young people where their opportunities just seem to be blocked here. I think that young Charles Jordan is a case in point because he's very successful elsewhere, as I understand. What did he do here, and what were some of the problems that some of the obstacles that he ran into in Palm Springs?
Well, in his job here, he was working out of City Hall.
Mm-hmm.
But as a blockage came there some way or another, some disagreeable some way or another. But anyway, he moved on to Portland, Oregon, where he pursued his job.
Mm-hmm. Well, he became very prominent there.
Very prominent in Portland, Oregon.
Mm-hmm.
So he stayed there, and then I learned that he moved on to someplace else. I don't know exactly right now where, but he left Oregon and gone somewhere else. Anyway, he pursued a good job in
Mhm.
Portland.
Mm-hmm. And there was back in the old days too. There was the late Myrtle Bennett. She came here from Louisiana,
Yeah,
and I understand she was a real fighter and activist. And
she was real good, and she was a chef or chief cook in her domestic way of doing. She served parties, and she served all the big parties, and then later she got in contact some way or another with Truman Capote,
the author. Mm-hmm.
and he wanted to show her off, and he had her to come to New York, and they was performs a program on TV, and she was very interested in what she was doing.
Mm-hmm. Now there's some other old timers. There was Mr. Jim Simpson.
Mr. Jim Simpson, he's here, and Otis Pelham, and
Mhm.
Herbert Carter. They all was prominent peoples around here, which were known very much. And Otis Pelham was a carpenter,
Mhm.
and he pursued his job until he retired.
Mhm.
So he lives in Banning. That's why he's in Banning. He moved from Section 14. All these peoples moved from Section 14.
Mhm. The time of this dispersion,
Yes.
more or less. Mhm. And Mr. Simpson has, a couple of years ago, celebrated their 50th, he and his wife, the 50th anniversary?
Yes, they celebrated their 50th anniversary, and he and her both is in their 80s.
Mm-hmm.
now.
And they're still residing in Palm Springs?
Yes, they still reside in Palm Springs.
I see. Now, Mr. Wash, Mr. Wash is another old-timer, wasn't he?
Yes, Mr. Wash, he lives out on Crossley Track, and I think he's a gardener, I think. I'm not for sure. But anyway, he tends the Angelon Baptist Church. And he's a very, I think he's a preacher too,
Oh, really? Uh-huh.
I think.
You say he's out on the Crossley Track. This is sort of the new Crossley Track.
No, that's the same. Oh, yes, the new Crossley Track outpost out there.
Yeah, that's out near the drive-in theater, is it?
Yes.
On Ramon Road?
On Ramon Road.
And they've named a street Crossley.
Crossley Road.
After that opened when, in the early 60s? Or
Yes, that's
somewhere?
where the Wash, they all settle out there.
I see.
And so, you know, it was quite a controversy when that Section 14 broke up. See, people scattered everywhere from north, east, and west. But didn't anybody go south? That was where the Palm Springs was going, that way.
And then there were the Blands.
L.A. Bland, he was
And his wife Lucy.
yes, they was prominent members here.
Where do they live now? Are they still around in the area, or?
L.A. Bland is in Indio,
Oh, I see.
and Lucy, she's passed on.
And then a gentleman Mayfield. What's become of him? He was a barber and letter carrier. And
No, he was a barber, and he was a contract worker.
I see.
And he's passed on, but he had a son named Paul Mayfield, which they sent him off to school. He went, then the scholarship gave him a trip to, well, in Africa someplace. And he was in a car accident and lost his life.
And there was a Mr. Knox.
Yeah.
What kind of reputation, what kind of things did Mr. Knox do back in the old days? Was he on the reservation?
Yes, he was a he was a reservation too. Everything come from the reservation. Everything was born on the reservation. Mr. Knox was a very nice man, and I think he worked at the Desert Inn. But he was a very nice man, and his wife, Eleanor Knox. Both of them passed on.
And there was a teacher in the early days too, Mr. Galden.
Yes,
and
that's
his
right.
wife.
That's right. Mr. Garland, he came here from Texas. I think it's some part in Texas. And he started a daycare center here. But anyway, he was moved on.
I see.
He didn't get a chance to pursue his job. He was moved on.
When you say moved on, this means that certain pressures were brought
Yes.
against him. In
Yes.
other words, it seemed to be a pattern that whenever a black was successful or did something, he established the first nursery.
Yes.
And so, in other words, it looked like he was succeeding too much, and
Yes.
so the pressures came, and he was forced.
He was forced
To move on.
To move on, and there was
I see.
another man by the name of Ernie Moore. He came on. Pressure sent him on.
Yes, I noticed this piece in the newspaper. Mr. Ernie Moore apparently was quite accomplished.
Yeah.
Yes, he made. I see here in the Press Enterprise, he made the statement. He was quite discontent. He was 36, Texas born, educated at Marshall College in Marshall, Texas, at the University of Indiana, and at Wichita State University in Kansas. And he concluded that blacks in Palm Springs are undereducated, underemployed, underhoused, and overcharged. That's an interesting comment. But that I presume that sort of sums up the way any number of people,
Yes.
due to their experiences, that's the way they felt about the experience and the situation, the conditions there. Well, Mrs. Crawford, we certainly wish to express our appreciation for your kind cooperation and
Thank
sharing your knowledge and teaching us something about those early pioneer days.
Yes, I remember some of them, and I remember, but I did the best I could.
Are you